And we are rolling on. Who put that? Can you erase that, please? The mentally ill. Yeah. Who did that? Who's mentally ill?
I am.
Okay, could you put it on over there, please? Yeah, thank you. Okay, and we are rolling on March 3rd, 2016 at UCLA, where it's a beautiful sunny day as usual. The sunshine is shining. And we're going to debate the question that the environmental concerns are more important than economic growth. I repeat, environmental concerns are more important than economic growth. For the affirmative, Brian. For the negative, Elizabeth. The chair will call this House to order and hear from the affirmative team, the leader of the government, for a speech not to exceed 7 minutes in length.
Hi guys, my name is Brian. Resolved, environmental concerns are more important than economic growth. This proposition is to be presented as a policy case in the affirmative. For some definitions, according to the Collins Dictionary, environmental is defined as anything concerned with the natural world of land, sea, air, plants, and animals. According to the Random House Dictionary, concerns can be defined as a matter that affects a person's welfare or happiness. Important is defined as having serious meaning or worth. Economic growth is defined as an increase in a country's capacity as measured by comparing GDP and GNP in the previous year. The affirmation believes that environmental concern can happen concurrently with economic growth. However, when weighed between the two paths, environmental concern, on balance, outweighs economic growth. So what is the problem? Human activity is one of the largest, if not the primary force accelerating the rate of climate change. Human deforestation, waste, and general disregard for carbon levels have resulted in the destruction of various habitats. According to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC, modern economics has led to the dependence for fossil fuels across major industrial countries. About 87% of the world's energy is dependent on these fuels. The burning of these fuels release large amounts of carbon dioxide and overwhelm the natural carbon cycling process. As our societies begin to grow larger worldwide, so will our carbon footprint. Economic success for many countries depend on the use or sale of the natural resources around them. Industrial demand causes an overshoot of consumption faster than the environment can recover. At the rate of our consumption, the Global Footprint Network explains that the Earth would need an average of 1.6 years to recover from the resources we consume within 1 year. This rate of consumption greatly endangers these communities and natural resources worldwide. Human pollution also remains one of the most direct and lasting threats to sustainability. The IPCC also indicates that our industrial runoff, chemical waste, and other unwanted materials are often dumped out into the oceans where these marine animals make their homes. This accumulation of unnatural waste in the ocean environments have sometimes devastating effects upon populations of creatures that live there, and it certainly is putting the delicate ecosystems at risk. For example, human waste has taken a toll on the California sea otter population as they are contaminated by both the chemicals and these newly introduced parasites. As 40% of the otter population deaths are attributed to these diseases, it holds major consequences for the kelp forest, urchin populations, and other marine wildlife. These alterations in climate have unforeseen and seemingly irreversible effects upon the environments and the living things that exist within them. So how big is this problem? The massive release of carbon emissions into the atmosphere on a global scale will only continue. The IPCC states that in their 2014 report that the accumulation of these gases leads to a noticeable increase in the surface temperature of the Earth, with predictions of the warming reaching to 1.4 to 5.4 degrees Celsius hotter by the end of the 21st century. Scientific research suggests that over 70% of the known species on Earth are threatened with extinction once this temperature rises just over 3.5 degrees Celsius. The world's oceans and forests are affected adversely. A global issues report on climate change from 2009 elaborates that the carbon collection in the water also reacts with any remaining oxygen molecules, forming carbonic acid and changing the seawater's composition in what is known as ocean acidification. At the rate of which carbon is being pumped into the atmosphere, oceans are only set to become much more acidic and less likely to support life. The Global Issues Report predicts that the populations of commercial fish and seafood are most likely going to crash by 2048. Further on, about 75% of coral reefs are considered to be under immediate threat of damage from a range of local threats, including overfishing and rising ocean temperatures. More than 3.5 billion of the 6 billion humans on the planet rely on the ocean or marine ecosystems as their source of protein, meaning that the loss of ocean environments are to have disastrous consequences for all, human or not. The Amazon forest is also at risk, being one of the largest carbon sinks in the world, in addition to being the home for 10% of all known species in the world. Research from the Guardian Newswire in 2011 illustrates that due to the deforestation, the damp rainforest floor has been drying out and is incapable of supporting the same amount of life and carbon intake it usually would. Impacts of solution are seen in Beijing, where the smog has become so unhealthy that doctors attribute 1.4 million deaths in the country to the air quality each year. Studies released from the International Business Times reveal that breathing the air in Beijing for a single day is like smoking 36 cigarettes or 1.5 cigarettes per hour. The scientific community has already seen a markedly fearsome accumulation of man-made chemicals in marine mammals. Such disregard for the safety of the environment at the hands of economic progress is a Faustian bargain, as the environment is our very source of economic prowess. So why do we have this problem? Our prioritization of economic growth without regard for the environment has resulted in the degradation of forest and marine ecosystems, many of which are heavily relied upon human populations around the world. So what's the solution? We must insist on sustainable development that combines environmental care, social justice, and economic growth. It is important to have regional cooperation in addition to international solidarity when it comes to commitment to sustainability, as countries with problems that are specifically affecting their shared regions may exchange information and risk management techniques for those issues. International leaders must do more to urge their citizens to adopt a sustainable way of life, providing incentives for research and investment into greener and more renewable energies. The subsidizing of these newer technologies would greatly help with the cultivation of better energy usage. Finally, as a culture, we must dispel our exceptional thinking. Human beings are part of the environment, and as such, we must change our behaviors in a manner that reflects our care and means to preserve nature. So will this work? Yes. However, this plan requires the utmost commitment to the goals and actions that may be required. So what are the advantages to my proposal? We can establish a sustainable way of living worldwide. We could reduce the impact of climate change related issues, and we would reorient cultural mindset about relations to the natural world. So on balance, which one outweighs? Referring back to the framework, having economic growth while being concerned about the environment is possible. However, the net benefits between the two lead to the conclusion that concern for the environment is more important than economic growth. In the end, there are only two realities we are debating: whether we could save the millions of dollars that might be made in the future, or the one planet that we have right now. Stand open for cross-examination and points of clarification.
That was 5:57. Chair will now recognize the leader of the opposition, who will stand close to the leader of the government, for a cross-examination not to exceed 3 minutes in length. Stand a little closer, please. Thank you. Pretend you like each other. Very nice. And the cross-examination may begin.
Okay, thank you, Brian, for your wonderful speech. So I have a couple of questions for you. In the beginning of your speech, you said that there is a huge dependence on fossil fuels, correct? You said that 80% of the world is dependent on this form of energy. So do you agree that if we took away fossil fuels, that this would have a detrimental impact on human beings because 80% of the population depends on this?
I do agree. However, the short-term effects are pretty destructive. However, the long-term effects would be even worse, as the quality of life would worsen with these citizens living in this economic condition, as the air they breathe would worsen and the water would not be clean.
Okay, so let's talk about Beijing. You said that it is so unhealthy that it results in a large proportion of deaths, correct?
Yes.
Okay, so how would we explain the fact, which is more significant, the fact that utilizing fossil fuels and having these polluting factories has actually alleviated 680 million people out of poverty in the last 30 years from China? So what's more important, people becoming sick or people being sick prior to even having economic growth, right? Like in both situations, the people are still harmed, right?
Yes.
Okay, so again, the point that I'm trying to get to is why specifically is environmental protection more important than economic growth? You talk about sustainable development, right? However, are you aware how much sustainable development is going to cost or how it's actually going to be implemented?
Yes.
Okay, so do you agree that sustainable development is something that is expensive?
Yes, it is expensive, but
Okay.
because we're not having government subsidies, that's why it's expensive. These companies have to come up with their own money, and if they had government subsidies, it would make materials cheaper, and then we could make greener technologies more accessible.
Okay.
One
so,
left.
Okay, thank you. So, okay, let's go back to the idea of sustainable development being something that is really expensive, right? So what does economic growth entail based on your definition? It talks about increasing income, GDP, GNP, etc., right? So if sustainable development requires capital, then why is environmental protection less important than economic growth? We need economic growth and we need capital to fund sustainable development, correct?
Correct.
Okay, so no further questions.
Okay, thank you. That was 2:30.
Okay.
Okay. Chair will now recognize the leader of the opposition for her speech not to exceed 7 minutes in length. She's managing attention, communicating respect, making sure everybody is looking up. Thank you for waiting respectfully at the door. Finding friendly eyes near the front and the center. Do you have a ballot?
No, sir.
Can you give them a ballot? Look at the extra ballots. So this is the topic. These are the people. Austin, do you have a ballot?
I do not have that.
We'll give you one here. Say your name.
Elizabeth Evangian.
Okay, there you go. And rock and roll.
I stand in the strongest negation for the following resolution. Environmental concerns are more important than economic growth. I agree with my opponent's definitions, however, I would like to add some resolutional analysis. This resolution entails a value debate because the motion questions the relative importance of two factors, environmental concerns versus economic growth. Nevertheless, for the sake of debate, while evaluating the value, the affirmative and negative must analyze the feasibility, costs, and benefits of the policy implications in a world that prioritizes environmental concerns versus economic growth. The nature of the resolution, however, is an overarching value. The resolution does not identify a specific region in the world, thus the affirmative has a burden to argue that environmental concerns are more important than economic growth in a majority of the world's nations, including both developed and developing countries. Thus, the policy implications must also be evaluated in the context of both developed and developing countries. What is the problem? Two broad categories, feasibility and harms. A, prioritizing environmental concerns over economic growth infringes upon the right and the need for developing countries to develop. Environmental concerns do undermine economic growth and competitiveness of developing countries whose economies depend on natural resources. According to Emoji from Breaking Energy 2014, he is a student at the China Center for Energy Economics Research. He argues that most developing countries, especially those in sub-Saharan Africa, depend majorly on natural resources for revenue and foreign exchange. These economics are driven by funds generated from exploitation of natural resources such as coal, oil, gas, etc. The livelihood of the masses also depends on these resources. For example, Nigeria, to maintain its current economic growth path and sustain its drive for poverty reduction, oil exploration and production will continue to be a dominant economic activity. Analysis. To advocate the prioritization of environmental protection over the consideration runs the very real risk of condemning already impoverished developing countries to an existence of perpetual poverty. By limiting the development of profitable but polluting industries like steel or oil refineries, we are forcing nations to remain economically backwards. And this is something that is really harmful. So if you believe that poverty is bad, then you should already be voting for the opposition. Next point is that protecting the environment is costly, especially for nations that cannot afford these costs. In the context of scarce economic resources, countries invest as a priority in everything that can bring growth. In this context, poor countries have few resources to devote both to satisfying the basic needs of the people and at the same time protecting the environment. In an indirect way, protecting nature may imply limiting access to natural resources, as my opponent pointed out himself. But natural resources represent an important, if not unique, source of funds for some developing countries. That was from Negoso, Public Reason Journal, Political and Moral Philosophy, 2013. Analysis. It is important to remember that most developing countries don't have a choice about the direction of their development. Prioritizing environmental concerns would mean less resource extraction, a shift of forms from energy to more clean ones, which can completely eradicate any comparative advantage some developing countries depend on for their very survival. First, they cannot afford these clean forms of energies. Second, if they obtain them, they cannot maintain them because they're developing, so basic infrastructure and human capital is still lagging. Third, the demand for their resources, such as coal, oil, etc., will be completely eliminated, virtually leaving them without an advantageous industry. D. Environmental policies implemented in the past by developed countries prove to be economically harmful. So just as an example from Murphy, Michaels, and Knappenberger from Cato Institute 2015, British Columbia implemented a carbon tax policy, and this resulted in a significant decrease in employment, and it weakened their economy. E. Prioritizing environmental concerns is not only explicitly harmful, but it also lacks reasonable feasibility. According to the Department of Economic and Social Affairs, World's Economic and Social Survey 2013 United Nations, meeting the Human Development Targets was found to be affordable only a minority of countries. One of the millennial goals is environmental or sustainable development, as he said. Mitigation policies designed to curb carbon emissions through the adoption of renewable sources of energy will require substantial additional investments. Given the existing financial constraints, accelerated investments for sustainable development could overstretch countries' public finances. Mind you, developing countries don't have these funds to begin with. So also, a significant share of the investments is necessary to achieve sustainable development will have to come from private sources. So again, how are you going to convince private actors to fund environmental policies that can potentially harm their own business? So basically what this main argument is pointing to is that we need capital in order to have environmental regulation. That is why economic growth comes first. There's a sequence of events that need to be followed. So we can agree that environmental concerns are important, but they are not more important than economic growth. So now let's move on to the fact that given that environmental protection is costly, it requires cooperation. These are two factors that countries are unwilling or incapable of committing to. McGrath, BBC News. One of the few decisions from 2009 UN Climate Conference in Copenhagen was for rich economies to provide $100 billion a year of financial support for poor countries from 2020 to develop technology and build infrastructure to cut their emissions. However, where that money will come from and how it will be distributed are yet to be agreed. So granting money is unfair to developed countries, and second of all, borrowing money is again infeasible because these developing countries would just further indebt themselves and it'll cause more problems. So again, infeasibility is a huge problem. So now let's look at the inherency. When we analyze the inherency component of this debate, we are asking the question, why are environmental concerns not as important as economic growth? A point that I would like to make is that environmental policies in the status quo are developed in terms of economic growth. Everything links back to economic growth. So to prove this point, even developed countries are abandoning their own environmental policies because of the economy. According to Ball Slate Magazine 2013, the United States did not ratify the Kyoto Accord, according in large that taking on an emissions reduction would hurt its ability to compete in global markets against China. Next, again, Ball Slate 2013, Australia's new conservative government floated bills to repeal the country's tax on carbon emissions. Days later, Japan announced it was abandoning one of its key carbon commitments. Japanese leaders said the country could no longer adhere to an earlier promise to cut its greenhouse gas emissions. This concession is an economic reality, even though it caused backlash among environmentalists. Next, I would like to point out a precedent about how nations have economically grown first, then they begin to environmentally regulate. Emoji Breaking Energy 2014. China would not have achieved the impressive economic growth and development it recorded in recent years if it cared about pollution at the initial stage of development. Other developed economies also, like OECD, are also focusing on environmental sustainability after achieving considerable growth and improvement of their living standards. So essentially what needs to be done is that countries need to develop their economies first before they can fund environmental policies. He has not explicitly shown as to why economic growth is less important than environmental concerns. All he did was show that environmental concerns are important, which I can concede to. For these reasons, I strongly negate the resolution that environmental concerns are more important than economic growth. I now stand open for cross-examination.
Thank you very much. That was 7:17. Okay, the chair will now entertain a cross-examination after he adjusts the camera for the taller debater. Good. And the cross-examination may begin.
Hi, Elizabeth. I'd like to ask you a couple questions about
Sure.
your proposition. So, when you mentioned that both sides of today's debate must look at the feasibility, costs, and benefits of policy implications,
Yes.
are you talking about short-term, long-term, or both?
Both, essentially.
Okay.
Yeah.
Moving on to my next point in your A about developing countries and economic growth. You stated in your speech that many developing countries must prioritize economic growth due to heavy reliance upon the natural resources around them, correct?
Yes.
Okay, so would it be fair to say that if these natural resources did not exist, these developing countries would not have economies?
Well, I don't think we can say what if. The point is that we do know that the entire well-being or the material being and the survival of these countries in the status quo is dependent on these natural resources. We can spend all day talking about what ifs, what ifs. What if we can pay for environmental policies today, then the world would be great, but we can't. So we have to look at feasibility.
Okay, thank you. To my next point about your B point, economic growth fighting poverty. So also you equated economic growth to poverty reduction in your
Yes.
B point. Is that correct?
Yes.
So high levels of economic growth would then reflect less poverty in the region?
Within a long term, yes, obviously that's not something that's going to happen overnight, but we can see that this is something that happened in China. 680 million people were alleviated from poverty as a result of using polluting industries. Also, we see Nigeria's economy is currently developing. The Congo Basin is dependent on their natural resources, selling their trees. We also see that India has refused to commit to certain carbon emission quotes because they specifically say that it is unfair for them to have their population remain backwards for the sake of the environment. So we see this in like a variety of countries that I provide examples for.
Okay, my next question. When mentioning British Columbia's average unemployment rate and changes in the economy, are these statistics explicitly linked to the implementation of carbon tax?
Yep.
How?
Okay, I can read you the card that's specifically saying that. If you just
The quote.
Yeah, so in the 5 years before introduction of the British Columbia carbon tax, the average unemployment rate in British Columbia was 5.6 compared to a Canadian average of 6.6. But in the 5 years after the British Columbia carbon tax began, the average unemployment rate in British Columbia was 7.1% compared to 7.6% in Canada. An overall 0.58, I lost the page. The labor market advantage of British Columbia versus Canada was cut in half if we look at the 5-year periods before and after the introduction of the British Columbia carbon tax. Now, I can concede to the point that causation and correlation are completely different things. But the main point that I'm saying here is that we see that there are going to be harms with environmental policies, and that's why Japan stepped back on their word. That is why the United States did not basically promote their allegiance to the Kyoto Protocol. That's why Australia also repealed their carbon tax. So again, aside from the British Columbia, there are a lot of examples of developing countries backpedaling.
That's fine. Thank you so much. That concludes our cross-examination period. And now we will have a refutation time from each side for looking to see the 4 steps of refutation. She said, I disagree because therefore. So let us first hear from the leader of the government for his refutation.
So my opponent argued that economic growth prioritization is needed so that countries can fight poverty. And during cross-examination, I asked whether economic growth would reflect low poverty rates in countries with natural resource exploitations. He said yes. This is simply not the case, especially with Nigeria, because what's happening in Nigeria, which is what known as the Dutch disease, in which recently discovered natural sources of wealth will see a huge influx of investment, while other industries will languish from neglect. Since 2000, the revenue was 98% oil concentrated. The profit from oil should have been seen. But 45% of the country's population lives far below the poverty line. And 80% of the overall revenues from energy sales benefit 1% of the population. The agricultural sector of Nigeria accounting for roughly 27% of the GDP and 67% of employment has fallen sharply due to investment and interest inundated in the new oil industry. So it implies that these heavily dependent countries relying on these natural resources are most vulnerable to climate issues, so which we are consuming at an alarming rate. and these developing countries have not taken steps to diversify their markets, and they're going to be plunged further into poverty if we do not focus on environmental concerns. On balance, between the two, we must focus on environmental concerns over economic growth.
Is that it?
Therefore, we should prioritize economic concerns on balance over economic growth.
Okay, thank you. That was 126. Thank you. Chair will now hear, just a minute, let me mark this down. Okay, the chair will now hear from the leader of the opposition for her rebuttal that hopefully will involve the 4 points, 4 steps of refutation involving the government's assertions.
Okay. First, I will begin by refuting my opponent's first speech. Then I will move into a refutation against the rebuttal he just made, and then I will extend some points that I made in my first speech. So first, beginning with his first speech, once again, I would like to point out the fact that in his case, he talks about how 80% of the world's population is dependent on fossil fuels for energy. So essentially, if we were to prioritize environmental concerns, that would mean that we would be completely eliminating something that 80% of the world's population is dependent on. One, this is a huge example of a harm that he has unrefuted. So now let's talk about how he talks about how there are irreversible effects. However, I would like to point out, actually in my constructive that I didn't have time to read, was that there actually is proof that when a country does develop economically, it will turn to then curbing its carbon emissions. And this is referred to as the environmental Kuznets curve, which was actually proved to be true by data analysis by George Chow and Ji Lee from the Pacific Economic Review, in which they proved the hypothesis to be true, that when an economy does develop in the long term, they will begin to prioritize environmental concerns. So now he goes in and he talks about how he gives one example of the Dutch disease and how Nigeria's use of fossil fuels or coal, etc., or oil has not resulted to poverty reduction. I would like to emphasize the
power
fact.
stance. Yeah,
Sorry, I would like to emphasize the fact that the point that I made, that countries do not have a choice in the direction that they develop, right? So again, the main point is that Nigeria's very existence and poverty reduction goals, the best that they are trying to do, is dependent on these resources, right? So we can't just take this away simply because it's not eliminating poverty. It is working towards that goal. Next, a huge point that I would like to emphasize is the fact that one, sustainable development in his case is something that is not feasible in the status quo. He completely neglects this point, that that developing countries, first of all, can't afford to do this, and second of all, developed countries do not have a commitment to do this. Next, he completely dropped the point that I made, that economic growth is more important because economic growth creates capital, and capital is something that is necessary in order to effectively protect the environment. I can concede to all of the harms that he says, like for example, oceans, the diversity within oceans being harmed, etc. All these cons, I can concede to them. But the fact of the matter is that he doesn't prove as to why economic growth is less important, whereas I prove that economic growth, which creates capital, is essential in order for environmental protection to be effectively implemented and enforced. Again, he completely drops the fact that developing countries especially don't have the infrastructure, the capital, etc. to implement these environmental policies. So on balances, the opposition is going to win this debate because we are not forcing developing countries to prioritize environmental concerns over the material well-being and survival of their populations, right? Like, environmental policies are extremely costly, which I have proven time and time again throughout my constructive, and so thus I firmly stand in the negation that environmental concerns are more important than economic growth. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. 312. Okay, you may cross the House and shake hands in the spirit of civility. We had a nice discussion. Now you may keep in your seat up there while the audience now does their job and votes. So if you could please individually and the points you hi, how you doing? The points you award are between 70 and 80, and you're to rank them one or two, and you know. if there happened to be 4 people in the room, you would rank them off 3 and 4.
You ever play cards?
Well, you have cards to figure out, so I can't say it. I did
Could
this
you
at
collect
William.
them for me and turn the light on back there? Thank you.
Great.
Here we go.
I rushed it.
You have 4 minutes.
Oh, I don't know why I thought I had less time. Sorry.
I thought it was 3 minutes too.
Yeah.
We'll make it 3, just to please
I
you.
thought he did this. I was like,
Okay. May I have the ballots, please?
Turn in, hold on. You got one more. Yeah, sorry. Give me time. I'm really valuing it. I'll tell you later.
Thank you. Do I have all the ballots? Who's Jeffrey? Great, he didn't fill out a decision. Good man. Okay, well, I'm going to infer from the way he ranked his decision. Okay. On a 0 to 10 decision, it goes to the opposition. Give me another round of applause. And we'll now have some comments.
Stand up.
Stand up for Buddha.
Hi, I'm Austin.
Hi, Austin.
So I did agree with Elizabeth. You kind of hit on the head for your case, whereas you gave a really good speech and like really important thing about the otters as a keystone species, about problems with environmental concerns. But what we didn't really get is a good enough, I guess maybe weighing or really tying it back to the resolution, right? So yes, environmental concerns are terrible. Now, why are they exclusive? Or like you said that like you can do both at the same time, but we never really got the really weighing mechanism of why they're more important than economic life. Why they, if you say that they can happen at the same time, then why don't we just do that instead? So I think that's what we really needed is maybe just a minute on like, well, why can this not be put into? Why can we not have them at the same time? Why do we need to prioritize economic or environmental? And I think with the background you've given about why environmental is so important, it would have been really solid. But we just really missed that important part, and because of that, I thought Elizabeth won the debate. Yeah, cross-examination, you just kind of answered yes to a lot of her questions. So you could have just like at least not given her the ground if you didn't know, just kind of at least thrown her off with her questioning stream. Even if like you didn't answer that well to them, at least it would have like thrown her off. But yeah, I mean, I thought your speech was actually good though. I thought it was very good. I just didn't think you tied it back at the end, which was important. Elizabeth, I mean, you just give policy speech, so I mean, I think you got to work on that. Like, it was you basically read most of your case, and it was like super fast. You never had any like time to breathe, any time for things to sink in, like dramatic pauses, which you could have done. I think he did call you out well though, is a Canadian article. I didn't really get a causal link.
Yeah.
And then when you tried to like refer back to it, you just gave like, you just reread the card, as you said. But yeah, we really would have liked, I mean, I would have liked to see more of the logical impact, which I guess is maybe just the BP. But yeah, so like why is there a causal link? Why is it that these specific 5 years were different than before? Because like the economy's also been all over the place in the past 10 years.
Right.
But yeah, yeah, I thought it was kind of like LG. And then, yeah, you also just kept talking about like how he dropped this point, he dropped this point, he dropped this point. Like, it's an LD thing. It's not the, like, you need to talk about occupying space, you know, like stasis and stuff. So yeah, obviously you did a good job. I thought you did a good job refuting his points and you built a solid case. But I would have preferred to focus more on a few points of construction than just give a bunch of points that he's going to drop.
Got it. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
My name is Sam.
Hi, Sam.
I voted for the opposition. Although I voted for the opposition, I thought Brian's argument was really good. But the reason why I voted for the opposition was because it seems like you could have done much more during cross-examination. I mean, you could have like that was the moment where you could have actually put pressure on her, saying like how the consequences of economic growth and how that like sort of ruins like the environment and things of that kind of. I sort of didn't like feel that. And Elizabeth, I really like that you focused on poverty and cost. You sort of pushed that like completely and sort of made good use of it. And lastly, in regards to Brian, I sort of feel like you could have refuted that by just saying like how what the status quo has done to the world. And why the status quo is sort of just bad, and I sort of didn't hear that like status quo push, whenever like she sort of emphasized that herself, and that's pretty much it. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Hi, Angela. I thought.
Say your name.
Angela. That's
Hi, Angela.
Hi. Anyways, so I definitely came into this debate believing the affirmative, but I had to give it to Elizabeth because she did a really great job debating. In general, I really did believe that Brian had a great structured debate, but I think the biggest issue was I think Elizabeth kind of switched the topics of what was spoken. She leaned more about poverty and she made it more about economics, which is obviously great and what should be like obviously what should be focused on, especially if you're the negative. But I definitely believe that Brian could have done something. I mean, its environmental concerns are more important instead of focusing on the feasibility and reality of everything. I think he should have stressed more of the importance, because really coming into it, environmental concerns, I believe personally, are more important. But then again, Elizabeth did a great job kind of switching those roles and making me believe in the negative, and so she really convinced me, and I thought that she did a great job.
Thank you.
They both did. Yeah.
Let me comment on just one quick thing, which I like about one thing you said, which is a mark of a mature judge. You acknowledge that you came in believing another way, and yet were willing to listen to both debaters and admit that someone else did a better job of debating, even though you maybe still deep in your heart, or are a tree hugger and still believe that environmental concerns are more important, right?
Yeah.
And so I appreciate your honesty in saying that. That's what we want. We want to leave our at the door if we can. It's hard.
Yeah.
We want to leave our little beliefs at the door. Yes, sir.
Hello, my name's Raymond, and
Hi, Raymond.
I think
You move over a little that way, please. No, Raymond, that way.
oh, okay. I think Brian did a great job in presenting his first arguments and how environmental concerns are very important. I think his case was presented in like environmental concerns are very urgent, but Elizabeth presented her case in which economic growth is basically essentially necessary, and many of her points supported that, saying how and she used his own case against him, like how 80% of the world depend on fossil fuels. So that's why I gave it to litigation.
Thank you, Raymond. Yes, sir.
My name is Dominic.
Hi, Dominic.
I also came in on the affirmative side, thinking like, what is economic growth without an environment? And I voted for the opposition only because I felt I was persuaded. I felt that what Elizabeth did that Brian didn't was she acknowledged the importance of of environmental concerns, but she stressed how economic growth is more important and how, in the long run, both are going to be addressed.
Yeah, and you're not going to get there if you
Yeah.
don't start with
Yeah.
some money.
Exactly.
Yeah. Good. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Akash.
Hi, Akash.
So yeah, I'm a biology major, so I was always
You go
I
that
came
way
in as
along,
an
yeah.
environmental affirmative side. But yeah, I think she did a really good job, sort of arguing and pretty much turning the case. And like I like the point that she mentioned that how capital is more important for effective protection of the environment, and how she also explained that Brian didn't really do a good job addressing that issue. And also the 80% of the population point was really interesting too. And I was thinking that Brian was going to do a good job because his speech was really good, but then he sort of like went down in the cross-examination because he's agreed, and I was like, maybe you should have done a little bit more explaining, or at least like trying to play around the bush and just confuse her, but he couldn't do that. But I really like his refutation though, where he mentioned the Nigeria point, and I was like, okay, at least he's coming back. But ultimately, she also refuted that one greatly, so I gave it to her. But I took one point away because she was too speedy and I couldn't really understand what she was saying.
Good. Yes, sir. Well, sorry is one thing, changing is another, and you need to do it quickly. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Diego.
Hi, Diego.
I voted for the opposition. Well, for one of two reasons. I felt that the quality of the sources were very, very convincing, personally.
Yes.
And I felt that Brian sometimes kind of leaned on emotion instead of giving like hard-sided evidence. So I did feel that there was a little bit of lacking on that. But I did overall like Brian's speech. I thought it was very, it did bring a call to action. But again, just the feasibility side of the argument it kind of just trumped it more. So I just ended up going with the opposition.
I'm going to make some general comments, but let me just say, at the beginning of the debate, you'll recall I asked for oral citations of your sources during your speech. They were in your brief, but when you watch yourself tonight, Brian, you're going to see you didn't give maybe one day, okay, during your entire speech. And a lot of your evidence was old. You violated the 3-year rule, so maybe that was why you didn't, read the dates of your sources. Yes, please.
Hi, my name's Jorge.
What is your name?
Jorge.
Hi, Jorge.
Hi. So I chose Elizabeth because Brian did a good job, so everyone mentioned already, explaining what the problem is. However, he didn't really give evidence or even talk about time frames, like how urgent is this? How urgent is it that we prioritize the environment? Also, Brian's sources, he didn't really cite that many of his claims. He did make vague, sort of accepted arguments of what is going on in terms of climate change and all this other stuff, but the sources were not there. With Elizabeth, she spoke very quickly, but that also helped her get a lot of more information, a lot more points out there. And also, the only problem I had with Elizabeth's sources is that a lot of them came from magazines and places that have an obvious bias. So, which makes sense because she was arguing something that opposing side of what he was arguing. So in the end, yeah, Elizabeth took the debate from me.
Okay, thank you for that. You weren't here, so you can be next, sir. Thank you.
My name's Arian.
Hi, Arian.
I like both speeches. I feel like Elizabeth was, her persuasion was geared more towards the fact that short term is a limiting reagent to this problem. And Brian's speech was more geared towards the long term and how that is going to be detrimental if we don't put environmental concerns over economic ones. I felt that you could grill her more on this during the cross-examination. While you did ask her if this is geared more towards short-term and long-term, she did say both, but you could have redirected and kind of grilled in more on that, I think, and that would have gone in your favor a little bit. But I didn't vote. I would have voted for the opposition because it was more persuasive in the assertion, the persuasion, and the cross-examinations.
Okay, thank you so much, Arian. Yes, please. Lose the hat. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Josh.
Hi, Josh.
Hi. I gave it to the opposition. Yeah, Brian.
You move over that way a little, Arian. No, you go that way. Yeah, good.
Yeah, Ryan gave a really good speech with regards to talking about both the planet that we live in and the human lives. But what really sold it for me was how Elizabeth pointed out that it's a structure or sequence. You need one before the other, and I like how she mentioned, I believe it was like carbon tax, and like that's basically saying like they did one before the other, and look what happened. But another good point was the sources. I thought a really good source was the one about the student at the university. That was really pinpoint, and like the year and everything was there.
Yeah.
And finally, she addressed both her stance and his. That really sold it for me because she could pinpoint like the holes in this argument. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, good. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Jason.
Hi, Jason.
So I gave it to the opposition, and I just wanted to start off by saying both of you had really great speeches. Just want to give some pros and cons about each one of you. So
yeah. I
feel like with Elizabeth's speech, she started out really good, like opening speech, just a little too fast, so I couldn't really like digest everything. But then, during her cross-examinations, I like how she pointed out some loopholes in Brian's arguments where, actually, economic growth and environmental concerns are actually related, and you need economic growth in order to care about the environment. So I like that a lot. One thing I think she should have touched on, she did deconstruct his argument a lot, but I think she could have brought in more examples in order to deconstruct his argument. For example, like I was kind of waiting for something like to say, global warming is a myth, Like, I don't agree with that, but I'm saying there's so much, like, evidence online against environmental concerns in general, so I feel like that could have been used against him. With Brian, I felt like his speech was very strong, but I didn't see how environmental concerns should be ranked over economic growth based on his argument. Yeah. I felt like more attention was paid towards environmental concerns. But I did like during his cross-examination, his questions, like how he was attempting to attack Elizabeth's arguments and whatnot. So yeah, in the end, I gave it to the opposition.
Good. Let me make a few comments, and then we'll start the next debate. Let's start at the top with Brian's case. Brian. I wanted to have more recent evidence, preferably no evidence older than 3 years old. You have some stuff from 2009 and stuff like that. So we want to have real recent stuff and cite that recent stuff. Secondly, it's already been highlighted, but you got to cut her off. You gave her open-ended questions, and she used your cross-ex to just run on and put more information out to the audience for her positions. So you needed to either follow up or have a close-ended question that would be not allow her to do that. On your plan, the model was a little vague and could use more specificity in exactly what you're going to do. I think part of what Elizabeth got away with was she was able to recontextualize this debate not into the modern world but into the third world. And if you had specified that this environmental concerns are more important than economic growth in, you know, developed countries as opposed to underdeveloped countries, you might have had a better chance. You obviously want to have less reading and looking up and to be more persuasive. And your refutation was 129, so you need to go through each of her points that she had in her case and go through a way to summarize it. She said this, I disagree, explain why, and then give impact. And that's why I believe that environmental concerns are more important than economic growth. See? You basically did one big refutation. See? And I wanted you to do more. Okay? So those were my comments to you. Elizabeth, I'm going to be harsher on you because I have greater expectations for you than what you came through with. Yes, Austin was right. This was, you know, a boilerplate, you know, counter policy analysis, which was good. If you're going to, since you're trained to go fast, train yourself to start slow, and train yourself to stop in the middle of your speech, to break your pattern, because you get going and you just don't stop. So one of our kids at 121 tournaments one year, Professor here now, Keith, used to have the greatest thing. He would go and he'd make a point, he'd beat a disadvantage, he'd 4 point, he'd say, there's no reason to vote against this proposal. Breathe. Disadvantage 4 now. And he'd go on. And just that dramatic pause would give a break and give a great contrast to. And if you just close your eyes and tune out the words, that's how you sound. And nothing is standing out. But real good in explaining that you can't have this without economic growth, especially in the third world. I would call this economic genocide, you know, because these limousine liberals in Beverly Hills that want to, you know, tell the third world that they have to have, you know, solar and wind. I ain't going to get it in Africa when they don't have, you know, electricity yet. You know, so it's really presumptuous of us over here to be telling them how to develop. I hated your rebuttal, just hated it. You can do a lot better. The drops are, you've got to lose that. You're not going to win any points on drops. You're not going to get any ballots this weekend on drops. So lose that word from your vocabulary. Secondly, what I didn't get was Brian said this. I disagree. Explain why. Give your rationale. But then go. This is what Austin was talking about. Then go back to the resolution. What I didn't get was the impact of you winning the argument each time. You were just doing just pure mini refutation on the points. You were just beating the points to death, but not saying what they meant to the overall question or context of the debate. Your sources were superior. I don't agree. You should have questioned global warming. I don't think that would have been a good road to go down. I think you went just right for this debate. Your cross-exes were good. You had more time and more follow-up questions. Overall, then, good job. Thank you. Okay, let's bring the next one up. Well, I changed the battery. Oh, you mean the final? Yeah.
We're gonna write it.
Oh, okay.
Good luck at the DMV. Same line.
Got it. Thanks.
Sure.